Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in Savannah, Georgia. The year was 1839, a time when Savannah stood as a jewel of the South, its streets lined with oak trees draped in Spanish moss, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets. The humid air carried whispers, rumors that traveled from the grand mansions on Abercorn Street down to the servant quarters behind them. It began with a notice in the Savannah Morning Republican, dated April 3rd, 1839. A small announcement, easily overlooked. Marriage license issued to widow Elizabeth Thornton, age 42, and James Bennett, age 26. What the newspaper failed to mention was that James Bennett had until recently been considered property, not a person, on the Thornton plantation. The subsequent scandal would tear apart not only the Thornton family, but reveal secrets buried beneath the floorboards of Savannah society for generations. Elizabeth Thornton, born Elizabeth Montgomery, came from one of Georgia's oldest families. Her grandfather had been among the first settlers in the colony, arriving in 1733 with General Oglethorpe himself. The Montgomerys accumulated vast wealth through rice plantations along the Savannah River, their fortunes built on the backs of hundreds of enslaved people. By all accounts, Elizabeth grew up sheltered from hardship in the family's three-story mansion on Reynolds Square. According to parish records from Christchurch Episcopal, Elizabeth was married at 17 to Richard Thornton, a widower, 28 years her senior, owner of a cotton plantation just outside the city limits. The marriage joined two fortunes, two names respected throughout Georgia. Richard Thornton's first wife had died during childbirth, leaving him with a son, William, who was only 5 years younger than his new stepmother. The Thornton household was managed with precision, at least according to the journals of Mary Berrien, a cousin who visited the plantation in the summer of 1826. "Cousin Elizabeth runs her household with remarkable efficiency," wrote Mary. "Though she appears delicate, she maintains strict order among the servants. Richard speaks little at dinner, leaving Elizabeth to manage conversation. There is a peculiar silence that falls when he does speak." Those who knew the family noted that Richard was often away on business in Charleston or Augusta, leaving Elizabeth to manage the plantation. What few realized was how much time she spent in the company of a house servant known only as Grace in household ledgers. Grace had arrived at the plantation in 1822, purchased from a trader in Charleston. What makes this significant is that Grace arrived with her son, then a boy of 9 years old. His name was James. Tax records from Chatham County indicate that by 1835, the Thornton plantation housed 47 enslaved individuals. Among them, James Bennett was listed as house servant, one of only 4 given such designation. Most were field hands, their names recorded only as numbers in inventory lists. But James appears repeatedly in household account books, first as Grace's boy, then simply as James, and finally as James Bennett. The addition of a surname was unusual and raises questions that have haunted Savannah historians for decades. According to Dr. Eleanor Hammond, who studied the Thornton papers in 1963 before they mysteriously disappeared from the Georgia Historical Society archives, James was taught to read and write, another unusual circumstance. The ledgers show purchases of books, slates, and pencils specifically noted as "for J.B.'s instruction," wrote Hammond in her unpublished manuscript, Whispers from Reynolds Square. Richard Thornton died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1836. His will, filed at the Chatham County Courthouse, left everything to Elizabeth, with a substantial inheritance for his son William, who by then was 29 and had his own plantation near Macon. The will contained an unusual provision. "The servant James Bennett shall remain in the employ of my wife, and shall not be sold or transferred under any circumstances." This provision would later be scrutinized by attorneys when the scandal broke. Why would Richard Thornton specifically protect one servant? parish records indicate Elizabeth observed a mourning period of exactly 1 year before she began to appear at social functions again. Neighbours noted that during this time the Thornton household seemed to operate without disruption, despite the absence of its master. It was during this period that witnesses later reported seeing Elizabeth and James Bennet in circumstances that raised eyebrows. Margaret Habersham, who lived on the neighbouring property, told investigators in 1839 that she had seen them walking together in the garden like companions rather than mistress and servant. A former kitchen maid, Sarah Johnson, whose testimony was recorded by a court clerk, claimed she had once entered the study without knocking and found them standing unusually close, James's hand withdrawing quickly from Elizabeth's arm. "They jumped apart like they'd been burned," she reportedly said. "Mrs. dismissed me right quick, but her face was flushed in a way I ain't never seen before." Winter turned to spring, and spring to summer. The weeks passed in a strange, tense quiet. Elizabeth Thornton began declining invitations to society events. Her cousin, Thomas Montgomery, wrote in a letter to his sister that he had called upon Elizabeth in February of 1838 and found her altered in demeanour, distracted in conversation, and dressed with a simplicity uncharacteristic of her station. He noted that James Bennet had served them tea and that Elizabeth addressed him with a familiarity that I found disquieting. The letter continues, "When I inquired after her health, she answered that she had never felt more alive. There was something in her eyes I did not recognize, something that reminded me not of our gentle cousin, but of someone with a secret joy." What happened next was documented in a series of increasingly urgent letters between William Thornton and his uncle, Judge Henry Thornton of Savannah. William, having heard rumors from former house servants who had connections to the plantation, wrote on December 10, 1838, "I have received disturbing reports regarding my stepmother's conduct. I pray they are malicious fabrications, but I fear there may be truth to them. I intend to visit the plantation unannounced next month to ascertain the situation for myself," Judge Thornton replied, cautioning restraint. But his letter contained an ominous line. "There have been whispers in certain circles. It would be prudent to address this matter privately before it becomes fodder for public speculation." According to court records filed later, William Thornton arrived at the plantation on January 15, 1839, during a cold rain that had turned the roads to mud. The carriage tracks leading to the main house were still visible the next morning when the sheriff arrived, summoned by what was described in official reports as a disturbance of significant nature. What exactly transpired during William's visit was never fully disclosed in public records. What is known is that William Thornton left the plantation before dawn the following day and rode directly to the sheriff's office in Savannah. By noon, James Bennet had been taken into custody on charges that were later dismissed. Elizabeth Thornton was not arrested, but according to church records, she was asked not to attend services at Christ Church for a period of reflection. The silence that followed was broken 6 weeks later by the marriage announcement. Elizabeth Thornton had somehow secured freedom papers for James Bennet, and then, in an act of defiance that shocked Savannah society, married him in a small ceremony performed by Reverend John Baker, a Methodist minister known for his abolitionist sympathies. The ceremony took place not in a church, but in the parlor of the Thornton home, with only 2 witnesses present, Grace, James's mother, and a lawyer from Philadelphia named Samuel Cooper, who had arrived in Savannah 3 days earlier. According to hotel registers from the City Hotel, Cooper stayed exactly 2 nights in Savannah before departing for Charleston and then north to Philadelphia, never to return to Georgia. The reaction was swift and merciless. The Savannah City Council convened an emergency session on April 5, 1839. The minutes of this meeting were later expunged, but according to newspaper accounts, they discussed a moral emergency threatening the very fabric of our society. William Thornton filed a petition to have his stepmother declared mentally incompetent and to assume control of the family estate. Judge Henry Thornton recused himself from the case, citing family connection, but privately wrote to the governor requesting intervention. The Montgomery family publicly disowned Elizabeth, placing notices in newspapers as far away as Charleston and Atlanta, stating that she was no longer recognized as a daughter of our line. What happened next has been pieced together from fragmentary accounts, as many records were deliberately destroyed in what appears to have been an attempt to erase the scandal from Savannah's history. According to a letter found in 1954 during renovations of an old house on Broughton Street, a group of 12 men visited the Thornton plantation on the night of April 10th. The letter, written by someone identifying himself only as a witness to infamy, described how the men surrounded the house carrying torches. They called for Bennett to come out and face justice. The widow appeared on the porch instead, a shotgun in her hands. She said only, "This is my property and my choice. Leave now or face the consequences." There was something in her eyes that gave even the angriest among them pause. The men retreated that night but returned with the sheriff 2 days later. They found the house empty, the furniture covered with sheets, as if the occupants had left in an orderly fashion rather than fled in panic. A search of the premises revealed nothing unusual except for a small room off the main library that had been emptied of all contents. According to Sarah Johnson, the former kitchen maid whose testimony was recorded months later, that room had been James's study, where Elizabeth had taught him to read and write, and where they often spent evenings together. "They cleared it out complete," Johnson stated. "Not a book, not a paper. Nothing left to show what went on there for all those years." The disappearance of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett launched what newspapers delicately called the most extensive search for persons of interest in Chatham County history. Ports were watched, roads patrolled, neighboring states alerted. William Thornton hired private investigators from as far away as New York to trace their movements. Yet despite these efforts, no confirmed sighting was ever documented. It was as if they had vanished into the humid Georgia air. Rumors, however, multiplied. A station master in Charleston reported seeing a white woman and a well-dressed black man boarding a northbound train the morning of April 11th. A ship captain in Wilmington, Delaware, told authorities he had transported a mixed-race couple to Boston in late April, though he could not positively identify them from descriptions. Most intriguingly, a banker in Montreal, Canada, reported in August of 1839 that a woman matching Elizabeth's description had attempted to access funds using documentation from the Philadelphia lawyer, Samuel Cooper. As months passed without resolution, the scandal began to transform into something else, a whispered legend, a cautionary tale told to young women of good families. The Thornton plantation fell into disrepair. William Thornton, having finally secured legal control of the property in October of 1839, sold it to a family from Virginia and never returned to Savannah. What he did with the 46 remaining enslaved people is not recorded in surviving documents, though a bill of sale in the Chatham County archives shows that at least some were sold to a plantation in Alabama. Grace, James's mother, was not among those listed in the sale. The investigation might have ended there, filed away as an unsolved mystery, had it not been for what was discovered 5 years later. In 1844, workers renovating the old Thornton house for its new owners made a disturbing discovery beneath the floorboards of the small study that had been emptied. There, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, they found a leather-bound journal. The journal was turned over to local authorities and eventually made its way to Judge Henry Thornton, who was said to have read it in one sitting before locking it away in his personal safe. The judge died 3 weeks later of what was described as apoplexy, a stroke brought on by extreme agitation. The journal's contents were never made public. After Judge Thornton's death, his widow claimed to have burned it without reading it herself, calling it a vessel of contamination. However, before its destruction, the judge's clerk, a young man named Thomas Wilberforce, admitted years later to having made a partial copy of certain passages. Wilberforce, who eventually moved to Boston and became involved in abolitionist causes, shared these passages with a researcher from Harvard University in 1861. According to that researcher's notes, found in the Harvard archives in 1958, the journal belonged to Elizabeth Thornton and contained entries dating back to 1822, the year Grace and her son James arrived at the plantation. The earliest entries described Elizabeth's initial interest in the boy. The child shows remarkable intelligence. R says, "I indulge my curiosity too much, but there is something in the boy's eyes, a quickness of understanding, that I have not seen in any child, white or black. Today I showed him my book of pressed flowers, and he named each one correctly after hearing me say it only once." Later entries documented Elizabeth's decision to teach him to read, conducted in secret after her husband expressly forbade it. R would be furious if he knew, but what harm can come from knowledge? The boy absorbs everything I teach him with a hunger that reminds me of myself at his age. Before I was told that a lady's education should consist mainly of accomplishments rather than substance. As the years passed, the entries became more personal. One passage from 1830, when James would have been around 17, read, "I find myself watching for him in the mornings, the way the sun catches his profile as he tends the garden beneath my window. I tell myself it is maternal pride in his accomplishments, but I fear it may be something else entirely, something I dare not name, even here." By 1835, a year before her husband's death, Elizabeth wrote, "We spoke of poetry today, and as he recited Byron, I saw not the child I taught, but the man he has become. I closed the book and sent him away. Later I wept, though I cannot say precisely why." The most revealing passages, according to the Harvard researcher's notes, came after Richard Thornton's death. With R gone, the house breathes differently. Jay and I walked in the garden at sunset, discussing plans for the East Field. For the first time, I asked his opinion not as a formality, but because I truly wanted to know his thoughts. Our hands brushed as we examined a damaged camellia. Neither of us acknowledged it, but neither did we move away. And later, we no longer pretend. When the house is quiet and the doors locked, he comes to the library. We read together, talk together, exist together in a way I never thought possible with any human being. He knows more of my soul than anyone ever has. I've begun to make inquiries about laws in other states. There must be a place where we can live without fear. The final entry, copied by Wilberforce, was dated March 30th, 1839, just days before the marriage announcement appeared in the newspaper. "Tomorrow everything changes. Sam Cooper has secured the necessary papers. Once the ceremony is performed, we must leave immediately. Jay fears for his mother's safety, but she insists on staying behind, at least initially. She says she will join us later, that someone must maintain appearances while we establish ourselves elsewhere. I have sewn what jewels and banknotes I could gather into the linings of our traveling clothes. The northern abolitionists Sam introduced me to have arranged a network of safe houses. I know the danger, I know what we risk. But for the first time in my life, I am choosing rather than being chosen for." The Harvard researcher's notes included a tantalizing postscript. Wilberforce claimed that in 1852, while visiting Montreal on business, he encountered a woman he believed to be Elizabeth Thornton. She was using another name, which he did not record, and was living in a modest but comfortable house in a mixed-race neighborhood. When he approached her, she denied being Elizabeth Thornton, but invited him to tea nonetheless. During their conversation, she mentioned poetry, and specifically Byron, which triggered his memory of the journal. As he was leaving, he noticed a portrait on the wall of a black man in formal attire. When he inquired about it, the woman smiled and said only, "My late husband. He passed 3 years ago from pneumonia." Wilberforce never reported this encounter to authorities. The Thornton scandal gradually faded from public memory, overshadowed by the growing national crisis that would eventually lead to civil war. The plantation was sold twice more before being largely destroyed during Sherman's march to the sea in 1864. The land was eventually subdivided and developed. Today, a housing development stands where the main house once was, and few residents know the history beneath their feet. The Thornton name survives only in a small street off Abercorn and in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, where researchers occasionally stumble upon fragments of the story while looking for something else entirely. In 1957, during construction of a shopping center near the original plantation site, workers uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 3 feet below ground. Inside was a cameo brooch, a pressed camellia preserved between glass plates, and a folded paper containing a lock of hair tied with blue thread. The items were turned over to the Georgia Historical Society, where they remained uncatalogued until 1963, when Dr. Eleanor Hammond examined them as part of her research into the Thornton case. In her notes, she observed that the cameo appeared to match one described in Elizabeth Thornton's wedding inventory from her first marriage. The pressed flower was identified as a rare variety of camellia that had been developed on the Thornton plantation. The lock of hair, when examined under microscope, appeared to be from 2 different individuals intertwined. Dr. Hammond's research was never published. According to colleagues, she became increasingly obsessed with the Thornton case, convinced that there were more documents to be found. In the spring of 1963, she traveled to Montreal to follow up on the Wilberforce account. She wrote to her department chair at Emory University that she had made a breakthrough and would return with evidence that will rewrite this chapter of Georgia history. 2 weeks later, her hotel room was found empty, her research notes missing. The only item remaining was a single pressed camellia, similar to the one found in the metal box placed on her pillow. Hammond herself was located 3 days later in a hospital, disoriented and unable to account for the missing days or the disappearance of her research materials. She abandoned her work on the Thornton case shortly thereafter and refused to discuss it until her death in 1968. The story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett exists now in the liminal space between documented history and legend. Parts of it can be verified through court records, newspapers, and personal correspondence. Other elements remain speculative, pieced together from fragments, whispers, and silences in the historical record. What is certain is that in the spring of 1839, a wealthy white widow and a black man she had once owned according to the laws of Georgia disappeared together, leaving behind a society scandalized not just by their defiance of racial boundaries, but by the implication that their relationship had developed over years, perhaps even while Elizabeth's husband was still alive, within the very household that was meant to embody Southern social order. The mystery that remains unsolved is not just what happened to Elizabeth and James after their disappearance, but what happened in the years before, in the quiet moments of teaching and learning, in conversations over books, in glances exchanged across rooms where others saw only mistress and servant. What words passed between them? What promises were made? And perhaps most disturbingly to those who discovered the truth, how many other households harbored similar secrets behind their respectable facades? How many other relationships existed in the shadows, defying the strict boundaries upon which Southern society was built? In 1969, shortly after Dr. Hammond's death, a graduate student cataloguing her effects found a sealed envelope with instructions that it not be opened until 50 years after her death. The university administration, concerned about potential legal issues, overrode this request and opened the envelope in the presence of attorneys. According to a staff member who was present but requested anonymity when interviewed in 1972, the envelope contained a single sheet of paper with an address in Montreal and the words, "They survived, they lived. Their descendants walk among us still." The paper was reportedly seized by university officials and has never been made public. The address, according to the staff member, was for a cemetery. Today, the story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett surfaces occasionally in academic papers, in specialized books on antebellum Southern society, or in whispered ghost tours of Savannah's historic district. Tour guides point to a certain house on Reynolds Square, not the original Thornton residence, but one nearby, and claim that on certain nights, particularly in April, witnesses have reported seeing a light moving from room to room, as if someone is searching for something or someone. Others claim to have heard the faint sound of poetry being recited, though they can never quite make out the words. These are merely tourist tales, embellishments for the curious, with no basis in documented fact. What remains factual is this. In 1839, Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett chose each other in a society that forbade such choices. They vanished rather than submit to separation. And somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten archive, in an attic trunk, or buried beneath a modern foundation, there may still exist evidence of what happened to them after they stepped out of recorded history and into the realm of legend. Until such evidence surfaces, their story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Savannah's history, not because of any violence or supernatural element, but because it challenged the very foundations upon which an entire society was built, revealing the fragile nature of social conventions and the extraordinary measures some would take to maintain or defy them. In the words attributed to the Harvard researcher who examined Wilberforce's notes, the most terrifying aspect of the Thornton case is not what it reveals about the two individuals at its center, but what it suggests about countless others whose stories were never documented, whose defiance never made it into historical records, whose lives were lived in desperate silence or erased entirely from memory. How many Elizabeth Thorntons and James Bennetts existed across the American South, their stories buried with them? And what does that tell us about the society that worked so diligently to ensure those stories would never be told? The question echoes still, through the moss-draped squares of Savannah, along the shadowed banks of the river, and in the silent spaces between the pages of history books. In 1972, during the renovation of an old colonial-era post office building in Schenectady, New York, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose brick in the basement wall. Inside was a small leather pouch containing 3 letters addressed to Mrs. Jane Bennett at an address in Albany. The letters, dated 1841 through 1843, were written in a flowing feminine hand and signed only with the initial G. Historians later identified this as likely being Grace, James Bennett's mother, who supposedly remained in Georgia after Elizabeth and James fled. The letters themselves contain no explicit mention of Savannah or the scandal, but spoke of a mutual acquaintance who had relocated north and was anxious for news from home. The most revealing passage came in the 3rd letter, dated December 18th, 1843. Our mutual friend asks after you constantly. The situation here has grown more difficult since you departed. The new master is not kind. Many have been sold away. I keep the secret you entrusted to me close to my heart, though there have been those who question me still. I tell them nothing. The item you left in my care remains secure where we discussed. When my time comes, I pray I will join you in the place where people may live according to their hearts rather than the dictates of others. What makes these letters significant is not just their content, but their very existence. They suggest that Grace eventually made her way north, contrary to official records which listed her as having died on the Thornton plantation in 1840. More importantly, they indicate an ongoing correspondence, a network of communication that allowed news to travel between Georgia and New York, despite the efforts of authorities to sever all connections between Elizabeth Thornton, James Bennett, and their former lives. Further evidence of this network emerged in 1959 when a historian researching the Underground Railroad discovered account books belonging to Samuel Cooper, the Philadelphia lawyer who had witnessed Elizabeth and James's marriage. The books, found in the archives of a Quaker meeting house in Pennsylvania, contained coded entries that scholars eventually deciphered as records of funds transferred to various locations along established escape routes for enslaved people seeking freedom. One entry, dated June 5, 1839, noted, "Special arrangement for T&B package delivered successfully to Montreal. Additional funds released as agreed for 5 years of security and silence." Dr. Marcus Williams, who studied these records before they were reclassified and restricted from public access in 1962, wrote in his private journal, "The Cooper accounts reveal that the Thornton-Bennett escape was not merely a spontaneous act of defiance, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan that may have been years in the making. The level of financial commitment, enough to ensure security and silence for 5 years, suggests not only substantial resources, but a remarkable degree of forethought. One must wonder, when exactly did Elizabeth Thornton begin planning her escape from Savannah society? Was it after her husband's death, or had she been laying the groundwork even before becoming a widow? This question became even more pertinent in 1964, when construction workers demolishing an old rice mill near the original Thornton plantation discovered a hidden space beneath the floorboards. Inside was a small wooden chest containing what appeared to be teaching materials, a primer, a slate, several pencils, and a copy of Byron's collected poems. The items were estimated to date from the 1820s or early 1830s, years before Richard Thornton's death. Most significant was a small notebook filled with handwriting exercises, lines of repeated phrases, gradually improving in quality. One page contained the sentence, written over and over with increasing skill, "I am James Bennett. I am a man. I have a mind." At the bottom of the page, in different handwriting, presumably Elizabeth's, were the words, "Excellent progress. You have earned your name today." The discovery suggested that Elizabeth had indeed been teaching James in secret while her husband was still alive, creating a hidden space where they could meet without arousing suspicion. The rice mill, according to plantation records, was rarely used after newer equipment was installed closer to the main fields in 1825. It would have provided an ideal location for clandestine lessons, far enough from the main house to avoid detection, yet not so distant as to raise questions about Elizabeth's movements. What remains unclear is how and when their relationship evolved from teacher and student to something more intimate. No documents exist that explicitly confirm the nature of their connection before Richard Thornton's death. However, a letter from Elizabeth to her cousin Anne Montgomery, dated October 18, 1834, 2 years before she became a widow, contains a passage that some historians have interpreted as a veiled reference. "I find myself living 2 lives these days. The one visible to society, where I play my assigned role with precision, and another that exists in moments stolen from the day, in conversations that could never be overheard, in thoughts I dare not speak aloud. It is in this second life, dear Anne, that I find myself most truly alive. Is that not the strangest confession, to feel most authentic when one is most in hiding?" The dual life Elizabeth described became increasingly difficult to maintain after her husband's death. As a widow, she would have been subject to greater scrutiny, particularly regarding her management of the plantation and treatment of the enslaved people she now owned outright. Several accounts from that period note changes in her behavior. Margaret Williams, a neighbor who recorded her observations in a private journal discovered in 1957, wrote in September 1836, "Called upon Elizabeth Thornton today, 6 months after Richard's passing. Found her changed in ways I cannot quite articulate. There is a restlessness about her, a barely contained energy that seems at odds with her mourning dress. When I mentioned the difficulty of managing such a large property alone, she smiled in a manner I found disconcerting and said, 'I am not as alone as one might think.' I left feeling strangely unsettled, as if I had glimpsed something not meant for public view." As Elizabeth's behavior drew more attention, so too did James Bennet's position within the household. According to testimony given later by house servants, he had begun to take on responsibilities unusual for someone of his status. Sarah Johnson, the kitchen maid, reported that by early 1838, James was effectively managing the plantation's accounts, receiving visitors when Elizabeth was indisposed, and even corresponding with merchants in Savannah on behalf of the estate. He sat at the master's desk, Johnson told investigators, used the master's pen, spoke with the master's authority, and Mrs. Elizabeth, she just smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. This gradual shift in roles, this blurring of the strict boundaries that govern Southern society, could not continue indefinitely without consequences. The catalyst, as previously mentioned, was William Thornton's unannounced visit in January 1839. What exactly he witnessed remains unconfirmed, but according to a letter he wrote to Judge Henry Thornton immediately after fleeing the plantation, it was a violation of natural order so profound that I could not remain beneath that roof for another hour without fear of committing violence. He described finding Elizabeth and James in a situation that admitted no innocent interpretation, though he refrained from providing specific details out of respect for the family name. The immediate aftermath of William's discovery set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to Elizabeth and James's marriage and subsequent disappearance. What is less known is that during the 3 months between William's visit and their marriage, Elizabeth began systematically liquidating her assets. Records at the Bank of Savannah show that between January 20th and March 15th, 1839, she withdrew significant sums, converting them to easily transportable forms such as banknotes and letters of credit. She also sold several pieces of jewelry through a broker in Charleston, as documented in a receipt found among Samuel Cooper's papers. Most tellingly, she transferred legal ownership of a small property she had inherited from her mother in Philadelphia to a corporation whose sole trustee was Cooper himself. These financial maneuvers suggest that Elizabeth was preparing not just for flight, but for a new life beyond Georgia. The careful legal arrangements, conducted through intermediaries and across state lines, indicate an awareness of the challenges they would face. Elizabeth and James would need not only to escape, but to establish themselves somewhere their past could not follow them, somewhere they could construct new identities secure from both legal pursuit and social ostracism. The most compelling evidence of this preparation comes from a deposition given in 1841 by a former clerk at a Savannah printing shop. During a legal dispute over William Thornton's claim to his stepmother's property, the clerk testified that in February 1839, a well-dressed black man, he later identified as James Bennet, had commissioned business cards and correspondence paper for a Mr. James Bennet, importer of fine teas and spices. The address on the cards was in Montreal. According to the clerk, Bennet explained that he was acting on behalf of his employer, who was expanding business interests northward. The clerk thought nothing of it at the time, but recognized the significance after the scandal broke. The business cards represented more than just a cover story. They were evidence of a future Elizabeth and James had envisioned together, one where he would be not property, but proprietor, not servant, but merchant. The choice of Montreal was strategic. As part of British Canada, it offered distance from U.S. laws regarding fugitive slaves. Its cosmopolitan nature and substantial mixed-race population provided relative anonymity. Most importantly, its status as a commercial hub would make a new tea and spice import business seem unremarkable. Just one more enterprise in a city built on trade. The actual journey from Savannah to Montreal remains largely undocumented, though fragments suggest they traveled by ship to Philadelphia, where Cooper provided temporary shelter and new identification papers, then overland through New York State and across the Canadian border. A receipt for passage on the schooner Mary Jane from Savannah to Philadelphia, dated April 12, 1839, was found among Cooper's effects. It listed two passengers, Mrs. E. Smith and Mr. J. Smith, described as aunt and nephew traveling on family business. What is known with reasonable certainty is that by August 1839, someone matching Elizabeth's description was attempting to access funds in Montreal, as previously noted. By November of that year, city directories list a James Bennett importer with a small shop on Rue Saint-Paul and a residence on Rue Saint-Antoine. The following year's directory adds Mrs. Jane Bennett at the same residence address. No mention is made of their racial identities or origins. Life in Montreal would have presented its own challenges, though of a different nature than those they faced in Georgia. While they may have escaped the legal consequences of their actions, they would have needed to construct a plausible narrative about their past, to explain Elizabeth's accent, to account for any differences in their appearances or mannerisms that might raise questions. The success of their tea and spice business would have depended not just on commercial acumen, but on their ability to present themselves convincingly as whatever they claimed to be. According to the fragmentary evidence available, they appear to have succeeded, at least for a time. Trade records from the port of Montreal show that Bennett's import business maintained steady, if modest, activity through the 1840s. Tax assessments indicate a gradual improvement in their financial circumstances, with the business expanding to larger premises in 1845. Church records from a small Methodist congregation note the regular attendance and charitable contributions of Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, described as a couple of mixed heritage, a designation vague enough to cover numerous possible backgrounds without inviting detailed scrutiny. The most intimate glimpse into their Montreal life comes from an unexpected source, a diary kept by a young woman named Marie Leblanc, who worked as an assistant in their shop from 1843 to 1845. The diary, discovered in a family collection in 1966, contains several entries describing her employers. Madame Bennett speaks French with an American accent, she wrote in one entry, but tries very hard to improve. She's always elegant, even in simple clothes, and treats everyone with the same courtesy, whether they are wealthy customers or street vendors. Monsieur Bennett runs the business with great attention to detail. They seem devoted to each other in a quiet way. They often exchange glances when they think no one is watching, little private communications that make me hope someday I might find such understanding with someone. In another entry, Marie noted, "Today, a customer from Boston questioned Monsieur Bennett about his background. He replied simply that he had been raised in the South, but preferred the climate of Canada, both meteorological and social." The man pressed further, asking if Madame Bennett was of European descent. There was a tension in the shop I had never felt before. Monsieur Bennett smiled and said, "My wife and I have found that Montreal asks fewer questions than other places, which is precisely why we chose it." The customer left shortly after. Madame Bennett's hands were shaking as she arranged the tea canisters, though she pretended nothing had happened. This incident highlights the precarious nature of their situation. Despite establishing new identities and achieving a measure of acceptance in Montreal society, the threat of discovery remained. One visitor from the south, one chance encounter with someone who had known them in their previous lives, could potentially unravel everything they had built. This persistent vulnerability likely explains why, according to Montreal property records, the Bennetts sold their business in 1849 and moved to a smaller, more remote community outside the city. The shop on Rue Saint-Paul was purchased by a French-Canadian merchant, while their home address disappears from subsequent city directories. From this point forward, the documentary trail grows increasingly sparse. No records exist confirming James Bennett's reported death from pneumonia around 1849, as mentioned in the account of Thomas Wilberforce's chance meeting with Elizabeth. However, death records from the period are notoriously incomplete, particularly for smaller communities outside major urban centers. What can be verified is that in 1852, the year Wilberforce claimed to have encountered Elizabeth in Montreal, a Mrs. Jane Bennett, widow, purchased a small house in Saint-Henri, then a separate municipality west of Montreal. The property remained in her name until 1867, when ownership was transferred to a Miss Grace Bennett, described in the deed as niece and sole heir. The appearance of this Grace Bennett raises intriguing questions. No previous records mention Elizabeth and James having a child or adopting one. However, the name's similarity to that of James's mother suggests a possible connection. Could this Grace have been James's mother, who, according to the letters found in Schenectady, had eventually made her way north? Or might she have been a child born to Elizabeth and James, named after her paternal grandmother? The latter possibility seems supported by an entry in the register of a small Anglican church in Saint-Henri, recording the confirmation in 1860 of a Grace Bennett, age 14. If accurate, this would place her birth around 1846, 7 years after Elizabeth and James fled Savannah. The existence of a child would add yet another dimension to their story, not just a forbidden marriage, but a family created across the boundaries of race and class that defined 19th century America. It would mean that somewhere, perhaps even today, there may be descendants of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett, carrying their legacy without perhaps even knowing the extraordinary circumstances that brought their ancestors together. The final documented trace of Elizabeth herself appears in 1869. 30 years after she scandalized Savannah society. A notice in a Montreal newspaper announced the passing of Mrs. Jane Bennett, formerly of the United States, at the age of 72. The brief obituary mentioned that she was survived by her beloved granddaughter and would be remembered for her quiet strength, her appreciation of poetry, and her belief in the equality of all souls before God. She was buried in a small cemetery in Saint-Henri, in a plot purchased years earlier that contained another grave, unmarked except for the dates 1822 to 1849, the approximate lifespan of James Bennett. In 1963, when Dr. Eleanor Hammond traveled to Montreal following Wilberforce's account, she reportedly visited this cemetery. Whatever she found there, whatever breakthrough she claimed to have made, disappeared, along with her research notes during her mysterious 3-day absence. By the time the cemetery was relocated for urban development in 1970, the graves had been moved to a common area without individual markers, erasing this final physical connection to Elizabeth and James's story. And so we are left with fragments, documents scattered across archives in Georgia, New York, Pennsylvania, and Quebec. Testimonies given decades after the events they describe, objects found beneath floorboards and behind walls, entries in diaries and letters never meant for public eyes. From these fragments, we can reconstruct the outlines of an extraordinary defiance, a rejection of the rigid boundaries that separated people by race and status, a claiming of human connection in a society that denied its possibility. What remains most elusive is not the factual record of what Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett did, but the intimate reality of who they were to each other. When did teacher and student become equals? When did respect transform into something deeper? What conversations took place in that hidden room at the abandoned rice mill over Byron's poetry and writing exercises? What promises were made in whispers that could not be overheard? How did they find the courage to imagine a future that everything in their world insisted could not exist? These questions linger in the silences between documented facts. They echo in the empty spaces where records should be, but have been deliberately destroyed or concealed. They haunt the corners of Savannah's history, challenging the carefully constructed narrative of the antebellum South. The story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett offers no easy conclusions, no moral certainty. It is a reminder of the countless untold stories buried beneath official histories, the private defiances, the secret connections, the human hearts that refuse to conform to the rigid categories imposed upon them. As the Harvard researcher noted in his final assessment of the case, what makes the Thornton affair so disturbing, even decades later, is not that it happened, but that it forces us to reconsider how many similar stories never came to light. If a woman of Elizabeth Thornton's social standing could maintain such a relationship for years, if she could eventually choose to abandon everything for it, how many others might have harbored similar feelings but lacked her resources or courage? The true history of human connection across the boundaries of race and class in America remains largely unwritten, existing only in fragments, whispers, and silences. In 1969, the same year Dr. Hammond's sealed envelope was prematurely opened, an elderly woman visited the Georgia Historical Society and asked to see any materials related to the Thornton plantation. According to the archivist who assisted her, she was in her 70s, well-dressed with light brown skin and grey eyes. She spent several hours examining the available documents, taking careful notes. When asked about her interest in the subject, she replied that she was researching her family history. The archivist later recalled that as the woman was leaving, she paused at the display case containing the cameo brooch and pressed flower found in 1957. She stood there for the longest time, just looking, the archivist said. Then she smiled, not sad exactly, but like someone remembering something from very long ago. She touched her fingertips to the glass and said, "Some stories are better left untold, but that doesn't make them any less true." The woman never returned to the archives, and no record exists of her name or where she came from. Like so much in this story, she remains another fragment, another whisper, another echo of a past that refuses to remain buried despite all efforts to silence it. In the end, perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of the Thornton-Bennett case. The persistence of human connection against all odds, the refusal of love, whatever its nature, to obey the boundaries society constructs around it. In a world that insisted certain feelings could not, should not exist, Elizabeth and James created a space for themselves anyway. First in secret rooms and coded glances, later in a life built far from everyone who knew them, and finally in the scattered traces they left behind, fragments that pieced together still have the power to unsettle us today. In Savannah, on certain April nights when the air is heavy with jasmine and history, tour guides still point to Reynolds Square and speak in hushed tones of the widow who scandalized society. Some claim to have seen lights moving in empty buildings, heard the faint sound of poetry being recited, felt a sudden chill in the humid air. These are just stories, of course, embellishments meant to entertain tourists seeking a brush with the mysterious past. But beneath these ghost stories lies something far more unsettling, the knowledge that the past is never as simple as we wish it to be, that human hearts have always defied the categories constructed to contain them, and that somewhere, perhaps, the descendants of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett walk among us still, carrying a legacy of defiance in their very blood.